Out. And are you planning to screen share or do you want me to spotlight you?
I would like to screen share.
Okay.
I guess I should go ahead. Are we ready for this?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. Okay. That's not what you need to see. Let's see. This is what you need to see. I'm gonna make you people become not so visible. All right. So I want to begin by thanking you all for coming. That's really cool of you to come in and listen to this. I'm presenting today on research I've been working on for a little while on worldwide religiosity. And as is often the case, I've been working on this quietly and alone, writing and typing and whatnot. And so I don't really have it down in terms of talking about it out loud, but I consider this to be an opportunity to get some practice talking about it out loud. And I hope you all find it somewhat interesting. So the title of this is Do Modern Social Conditions Really Make People Less Religious? I'm analyzing worldwide data on this question from 1981 to 2014. Okay, I have a key research question or two. Probably the primary one is, do modern social conditions, and by that I mean urbanicity, education, economic security / wealth, and cultural globalization, do these things cause people to become less religious? And do they do so in general across different societies and cultures? In addition, are people around the world becoming less religious? Now, what motivates this, what the rationale for asking these questions, is that I'm essentially responding to secularization theory. I'm sure some of you have some familiarity with secularization theory. It's been around for a while. It's actually a group of theories, technically speaking, but they have in common that they say that religion will increasingly lose its influence in the modern world. That's the contention. And specifically, people will become less religious over time in response to modern social conditions. Now, this idea is, like I said, has been around for a long time. Karl Marx, Max Weber, Sigmund Freud all argue this, but secularization theory is influential today as well throughout the social sciences, certainly within the sociology of religion. This continues to be an influential perspective on the place of religion in the modern world. The idea being that the place of religion in the modern world is pretty shaky and ebbing. In this study, I'm especially focusing and reacting on this part of secularization theory, the idea that people will become less and less religious over time in response to modern social conditions, which for me are urbanicity, education, cultural globalization, and economic security. Things secularization theory would lead us to expect. So I'm going to real briefly go over this question of what secularization theory would lead us to expect. First of all, urbanicity. Urbanicity refers to living in a city instead of living in the country, essentially. The expectation from secularization theories would be that urbanization disrupts the community ties that encourage religious belief and practice. So the more urbanized a country is, or the more urban a person is in terms of where they live, the less religious they will be. When it comes to education, the expectation derived from secularization theories is that education undermines religious worldviews. That would be the expectation or argument there. And so the more educated you are, the less religious you should be. Economic security or wealth, well, the expectation here is that when people feel economically secure, they feel like, they know where their next meal is going to come from, they have proper shelter, basic things like that, they feel very economically secure. Well, when that happens, then religion becomes psychologically unnecessary for them. This is the post-materialist thesis. So the more wealthy, or at least economically secure you are, the less religious you will be. That's the idea. And final factor, cultural globalization. Cultural globalization refers to the spread of ideas and values around the world. The expectation here, derived from secularization theories, is that cultural globalization undermines religiosity by exposing people to a diversity of beliefs. So you're exposed to a diversity of beliefs from around the world, and that undermines the taken for granted nature of religion. Side note here, The word religiosity just refers to how religious someone is. If you're high in religiosity, then it means you're really religious. So with cultural globalization, again, the idea is the more exposed you are to cultural globalization, the less religious you're going to be. And finally, an additional expectation that you can draw out of secularization theories is that modern social conditions, again, urbanicity, education, economic security, globalization, are going to have a consistent or universal negative effect on how religious people are. People are going to be less religious when they're exposed to these modern social conditions across different societies and cultures. You can actually compare this way of thinking about causality to the way people think in the natural sciences. So imagine you're a chemist, for example. You have a beaker and you add two chemicals together, and then some sort of chemical reaction occurs. Well, the chemical reaction that occurs is not going to be dependent on which society you're in or what time in history you're in. So that's a basic assumption of most of the natural sciences. The question here is, can you make that assumption when it comes to the effect of social conditions on how religious someone is? Is that going to be totally independent of the time in history and the society we're talking about? And the answer for most of these secularization theories is the effect of modern social conditions on religiosity. It's not going to depend on what society you're in, or at least there's going to be fairly consistent effects across societies of, economic security, for example. Economic security should make people less religious, no matter when you're living, no matter where you're living. Okay, the current state of our understanding and what this particular study does. Okay. I'm sorry for all the writing, but I'll try and make this not too onerous for people. There's a lot of studies that have examined the effect of modern social conditions on religiosity around the world, and many, or probably most of them, find in favor of secularization theory. So they find that there's an association between modern social conditions and how religious people are. However, I would argue there's several limitations with the studies that have been conducted thus far. For example, scholars have not examined how worldwide change in modern social conditions affects religiosity. So the studies that have been conducted so far have looked at a single point in time and have said, okay, well, is a country with more modern social conditions or a person with more modern social conditions, are they more or less religious as compared to someone at the same point in time? But they're not looking at, for example, a given country, if it becomes more urban and educated and so on over time, does that also mean that that country will become less religious over time? That has not been studied at a worldwide level. Another thing we don't know, researchers have not tested whether the relationship between modern social conditions and religiosity varies around the world. So the worldwide studies have not considered the possibility that there might be variation in this relationship around the world, for the most part. And we know, this is actually surprising, but we know surprisingly little about how worldwide levels of religiosity have changed over time. We know a fair amount about Europe, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, and how levels of religiosity have changed over time in those societies. But we know very, very little, in some cases, just about nothing is published on it about what's been going on with developing countries and how levels of religiosity have changed over time in these countries. Okay, so those are some gaps that I'm going to try and address. What this study does, first, I examine whether there were widespread decreases in religiosity around the world between 1981 and 2014. The fact is that modern social conditions have been very much on the rise around the world over this period. So the world has gotten a lot more urbanized, a lot more educated on average, more economically secure, and a lot more culturally globalized. Since that's the case, if secularization theory is on target, then we would expect there to have been widespread declines in religiosity around the world. So I investigate that. The study also examines the association statistically using regression analysis between modern social conditions and religiosity. And I do that at multiple levels of analysis. I look at whether at a given society, at a given point in time, whether more urban, educated, et cetera, individuals are less religious than others. I look at, as a society becomes more urban, more educated, more globalized, all of these things, does it become less religious? And I have that highlighted because that's something that hasn't been done before. And I also look at whether comparatively more educated, globalized, economically secure societies are less religious than others. Additionally, I examine whether modern social conditions and religiosity are associated with each other in the same way across different socio-cultural contexts. So what I'm doing here is I look across different world regions that are thought to have similar cultural backgrounds. I look across these different world regions and I ask, okay, is the association between modern social conditions and religiosity consistent and consistently negative across these different contexts? Which has, again, not been done. So data and methods, I'll go really skimpy on this one. I will say that the study examines data on about 100 countries and 400,000 individuals between 1981 and 2014. Data on how religious people are, which is my dependent variable, are from the Integrated World Values Survey, European Values Survey. To measure religiosity, I use the religiosity scale, combining questions regarding importance of God in your life, whether you're a religious person, and frequency of attendance at religious services. So I'm trying to get multiple facets of religiosity combined there. I also experimented with alternate scales and got essentially the same results as I got for this one. Methods, I use regression analysis to analyze my data statistically. Specifically, the kind of regression analysis I use is 3-level hierarchical linear models, which is hard to say quickly. My results. Okay, I want to highlight 3 different kinds of results that I have come up with based on this analysis. Number 1, I find that declines in religiosity were not widespread around the world between 1981 and 2014. Now I'm going to show you some charts on this. And in fact, let me get out the laser pointer. Okay, so here you have data on religiosity from 1981 to 2014 for different regions around the world. The gray dots are specific countries and their average level of religiosity over time. And then the bold black lines are the average level of religiosity for the region as a whole. What you can see is in Western countries like the United States, most countries have become less religious, and that includes the United States. In case you're curious, the United States has become less religious over this period. You also get some dip in religiosity in Latin America and the Caribbean and in Southeast Asia. But interestingly, this is counterbalanced by increases in other world regions. So in the former Soviet and Eastern Bloc countries, you get an overall increase in how religious those countries were. Also, to some degree, you get an increase in religiosity in the Middle East and North Africa over this period. Meanwhile, some other world regions like Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia have just stayed at a high but pretty stable level of religiosity. So when you balance all those regions together, the world average level of religiosity has stayed super stable over time. Now, this result does not support secularization theory because, like I said, levels of modern social conditions have all been rising around the world. The fact that religiosity has stayed stable casts some doubt on this theory. Now, these results are mostly descriptive, so I'm going to turn over now to some more advanced statistical methods. Okay, statistical results for the worldwide association between modern social conditions and religiosity. Now, secularization theory is going to lead us to expect that more modern countries, modern in quotation marks, more modern countries are going to be less religious than countries with lower levels of modern social conditions. It's also going to lead us to expect that as countries get more modern in terms of education and urbanicity and all these things, these countries will also get less religious over time. Is that true? Okay, here's a chart. Let me draw your attention to this first column here. What this shows you is that, okay, here I have a negative sign. I'm trying to kind of abbreviate these findings, so you don't have to read a bunch of statistics. What this indicates is that comparatively more urban countries were less religious, and that was statistically significant. However, comparatively more educated countries were not less religious. There was no statistically significant association. And unfortunately, with economic security and globalization, results were inconclusive. So when it comes to just comparing at a single point in time, comparing between countries, we're getting mixed results so far as secularization theory goes. But now turn to this over time associations. So as countries get more urban, educated, economically secure, more globalized, do they become less religious? Answer, no, not based on my findings. So there's no association between change over time in urbanicity, education, and economic security and how religious a country is on average. And surprisingly, there's a statistically significant positive association between cultural globalization and religiosity, meaning that as a country gets more exposed to the outside world, more culturally exposed to the outside world, it on average becomes more religious, net of all other factors. I'm controlling for a number of factors here. That's directly counter to what secularization theories would lead us to expect. Okay, so that's at the nationwide level. At the individual level, the simplest thing for me to do is super quickly, I'm almost done here, super quickly show you the region by region data. So what I looked at was at a given society in a given point in time, are the more modern, so-called more modern people, the more educated, urban, high-income people, are they less religious? Secularization theories would lead you to expect. The answer, and what I've done here specifically is I've looked at this question region by region, rather than, I actually looked worldwide too, but I'm showing you the region by region data, which is the most interesting. What I find is that in most world regions, and here you can see that I had 8 world regions that I've examined. In most world regions, there's no negative association between modern social conditions and religiosity. And this runs directly counter to what secularization theories would lead us to expect. It's also interesting to note that the relationship between modern social conditions and religiosity is not consistent cross-culturally or cross-regionally. And so there's a lot of variation, which again is counter to what secularization theory would lead us to expect. So people who live in more urban areas are less religious in these first three world regions, the West, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and the former Soviet and Eastern Bloc. But there's no association between urban residents and religiosity in the other 5 world regions. With education, you get a negative association between education at the individual level and religiosity in 2 world regions, but you actually get a positive association. So people in sub-Saharan Africa who are educated are more likely to be religious, which again runs counter to what you might expect. You might ask how such a result would be explained. One possible factor is that in sub-Saharan Africa, the literature indicates that Christianity and Islam are both associated with modernity and with being modern. And so maybe educated individuals are attracted to these religions on that basis. And then finally, with income, only in 1 world region out of 8 were high-income individuals less religious than other people. And in 1 world region, Southeast Asia specifically, high-income individuals were more religious than other people at a statistically significant level. If it's zeros, then there was no statistically significant association. So this is, really not supporting secularization theory. Okay, in conclusion, there's I find little evidence that modern social conditions are secularizing based on these new tests of the theory that I have performed here. Contrary to what secularization theories would lead us to expect, the world average level of religiosity did not decline between 1981 and 2014. The expectation that in general, modern social conditions reduced religiosity is not supported. And finally, the relationship between modern conditions and religiosity varies, I find, across contexts rather than following a single universal pattern. The fact that it varies across cultural contexts or regional contexts is really interesting and suggests if you really want to find out what's causing people to be more or less religious, you probably need to go down to a lower level and not assume that there's consistent relationships between modern social conditions and religiosity. Probably you need to start looking at cultural variation and distinctive cultural factors that are driving religiosity to be high or low. So that's it, folks. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lisa. Excellent presentation. We're gonna move on to Kyler. Are you there, Kyler? Perfect.
Yep.
And just as a reminder, everyone, please do introduce yourselves and you know, your major, department, and everything.
How do I start sharing my screen?
You should just be able to hit the green button at the bottom.
Oh.
So you're where you can see all of our faces. If you scroll down, you should see there we go. Perfect.
Got it. All right. All right. Hello, everybody. I'm Kyler Bowder. I'm currently a nursing major, and I'm doing my presentation on feral children and the effects of socialization has on behavior. A little background about this. The main focus of this presentation was a poster we had to make in class to bring awareness to a not so prevailing topic and explain the findings that feral children provided us as like a researching society. The basic means of this was to show the importance of what behaviors they exhibit and why they are a certain way. This was the poster I handed in for our class project. As you can see, the introduction, feral children are young people that have grown up in socialization or in isolation. The cause can vary from abandonment or abuse or accidental with parents. Due to the lack of human contact, these children do not go through socialization and often have many unusual characteristics. Feral children are myths and misconceptions about feral children. Feral children are not the typical depicted wild kids that are raised by nature's craziest animals. These myths and legends aren't a reality. Many children don't survive the environment without the protection and care of a guardian. They just have a reduced exposure. Many of the things that come to mind in this include like Tarzan, and things with our society depict feral children as more wild, and that's just not the case. It's just they are isolated, and for that reason, they act a certain way and don't have the certain social norms. Background information. The feral children that do survive aren't completely alone. These kids were raised with minimal, loving social relationships. They do not hold social norms because they weren't raised in normal society during a critical time of growth. Without this, many kids that are brought back and saved from the conditions there are often closer to the natural state of human behavior. Because they didn't go through socialization, everything is more nature and less nurture, which I will get to. The importance of the result. Although we do not purposely do this to kids, it does give a great insight into the nature versus nurture question. Many variables go into personal and group behavior, and this specific way helps sociologists study certain aspects of our history and development. As we help find and take in these unfortunate children, we're able to better understand why people behave the way they do and how impactful certain aspects of socialization are to our development. And these are my sources. So that was the poster I handed in for class.
Are you trying to stop sharing?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, there we go. Got it. And thank you, Kyler, very much. So next we have Madison.
Sorry, I think I don't know if my Zoom is working.
It's okay.
Okay.
You can give another try, and if it doesn't, just reset Zoom, and we'll certainly hold for you.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Perfect. Hello, my name is Madison Yoakum. I'm a kinesiology major, and today I will be talking about the foster care system. There are numerous issues within the foster care system. However, I just want to focus on one of them, which is the emancipation of children. This is also called aging out of the foster care system, and I'd like to focus on the challenges and risks people face as they are emancipated and what should be done as a society to help these children as they are emancipated. First, I wanted to start with the basics and describe what the foster care system is, and then what government organizations are involved in their role in the system. The foster care system provides temporary caregivers and homes for children who do not have steady homes. The foster care system is intended to be a temporary arrangement, but the average time a child spends in it is 2 years. The end goal is to give children a stable, safe home where they can learn, live, and grow. Very briefly, I just want to point out a couple of key points that this poster makes. It states that over 400,000 children live in the foster care system in the United States, and out of the 74.2 million children in the US, 1 in 184 children in the US are in the foster care system. And this is roughly the population of Cleveland, Ohio. But for a better comparison, I looked it up and compared to the state of South Dakota. And the number of children in the foster care system in the US is a little less than half of the population of South Dakota. We will discuss this next statistic more in depth in a little bit, but 23,000 children age out of the foster care system each year. There are 3 federal organizations that are involved in the foster care system, and they each play a significant role in making sure that the system is working as it should. However, with the foster care system not being any of their main specific priorities, it does not run perfectly. All of these organizations work on children's programs to prevent child abuse and provide safe, educated families for foster children. The first of the 3 organizations is the Children's Bureau, which has the biggest role in the foster care system. The Children's Bureau focuses on improving the well-being and overall health of each child in the foster care system. It also focuses on the prevention of child abuse and neglect within the system. This is a common fear for children and sadly something the foster care system is known for. The majority of children placed into foster care come from families where they were neglected and abused. So children usually are very fearful because it's all they know. The Children's Bureau provides resources and support to foster care families throughout the US, and they seek to improve in 3 main categories: safety, well-being, and permanency. Along with the Children's Bureau, the Administration of Children and Families, and the U.S. Department of Health provide programs to assist in the economic and social well-being of everyone involved in the foster care system. The funding from these 2 organizations goes to strengthening and educating families and communities about foster care. Now we are going to look deeper into the aging out I mentioned earlier. A total of 23,000 people age out of the foster care system. Emancipation is also known as aging out. It is when you become too old to be a dependent, and this usually happens between the ages of 18 and 21, depending on the state. Aging out of the foster care system can result in having absolutely nothing: no place to live, no high school diploma, no job, and no community. This is the most common way for people to leave the foster care system. Many times, Emancipation Day is viewed as a celebration, but 2 people from California state that their Emancipation Day ended up being anything but a celebration. On my day of so-called emancipation, I didn't have a high school diploma, a place to live, a job, nothing. The day I was emancipated, it was a happy day for me, but I didn't know what was in store. Now that I'm on the streets, I honestly feel like I would have been better off in an abusive home with a father who beat me. At least he would have taught me how to get a job and pay the bills. The day I graduated from high school, my foster mom told me, "You've been emancipated. You can't live here anymore." My social worker showed up. I was still in my little graduation dress and heels and flowers and on my cap on. My social worker had never talked with me. She just told me, "I've called around and found a shelter for you. You have a bed for 4 months." After hearing both of these personal testimonies on the emancipation process, I was very interested in looking into how emancipation affects the quality of life for foster children. I found a graphic that shows the impacts of emancipation that the emancipation has on young people. It starts with the large number of children in abusive families. This reports that 3.3 million reports of violence against children cause over 250,000 children to be placed into the foster care system. It emphasizes that a better life with safety, family, and a home was promised to these 250,000 children, but instead about 23,000 are aged out of the system. Of the 23,000 aged out, 1 in 4 will experience PTSD, whether it's from an abusive home life or a lack of a stable support system. 71% of the women will become pregnant by age 21. Less than 3% will earn a college degree, and only half will be employed by the age of 24. And 1 in 5 will end up being homeless after age 18. Homelessness after emancipation is a common struggle for young adults. As they leave the foster care system, there are many negative consequences that come from being emancipated at such a young age, and without proper education or working experience. These consequences often lead to lifelong struggles like poverty, early pregnancy, or criminal victimization. When living in homeless communities, it is easy to become involved in criminal behavior when trying to make ends meet. Some of the most common situations that happen with deviance is when people struggle. They often get involved with crime in hopes that it will help them obtain an income to get themselves out of poverty and danger. In the end, the goal is to get out of poverty. But when people get involved with criminal behaviors, being caught by authorities often leads to square zero and having to go through this struggling cycle over and over again. This next graphic is by a group called Success Beyond 18, and it is a good visual for showing the issue of aging out of the foster care system and a solution. Success Beyond the age of 18 or Beyond 18 is an initiative that works to ensure that young people ages 14 and 26 who have spent at least one day in the foster care system have access to resources, relationships, and opportunities. Success Beyond 18 focuses on 4 pillars of permanence, stable housing, education success, economic security, and parenting support. The graphic starts by briefly talking about the problem young adults face when they are emancipated and how they often make costly consequences that affect all Americans. This graphic estimates that the cost of doing nothing for every young adult that is emancipated is $300,000 per person. This $300,000 in taxpayer money covers the average cost for public assistance, incarceration, and costs absorbed by the community. With roughly 26,000 people aging out every year and an estimated of $300,000 per person, the total is at $7.8 billion in total costs. Success Beyond 18 is a group that describes this as a solvable problem. They state that despite these realities, there is room for optimism. There is a financial incentive to states that extend the foster care system for young people beyond the age of 18. And their research shows that teenage brains are still developing, which provides a second chance for these kids to overcome adversity. The first signs of improvement have come from numerous states that have extended foster care beyond the age of 18. This is an important first step, however, it is not enough. Success Beyond 18 says that states also need to enact reforms to the foster care system. There are many potential benefits of extending foster care and doing it right. Some of them mentioned are more young people will be connected to caring families, adults and support systems. More young people will be able to complete high school, vocational training, and even college. More young people will be employed, and there would be fewer unplanned pregnancies with lower healthcare costs. Moving into the last section called the Formula for Success, Beyond 18 says that when extending foster care, it is about quality, not quantity. It also calls for states to do it right by helping young people achieve permanent and lasting relationships by the time they age out of the system. Supporting young people in developing relationships and networks that support their healthy development and give kids in foster care the opportunities and responsibilities to plan and direct their own futures. Along with the solution we talked about with Success Beyond 18, there are also other ideas for solutions out there. The Human Rights Watch has 4 recommendations they believe will improve the foster care system. The first one overlaps with the Success Beyond 18 solution by extending care and support past the age of 18, which would make the transition to adulthood easier. With financial and emotional support while transitioning out of the foster care system, young adults would have more opportunities to learn how to become self-sufficient without having to worry about basic needs. The second suggestion the Human Rights Watch has is guaranteeing a useful emancipation plan for all young adults aging out of the foster care system. These plans should be put together and include housing plans and a community. The third and fourth recommendation tie into providing opportunities to develop skills for relationships and independence that would help them throughout their transition into adulthood. I think this can be achieved by figuring out how to build small apartments where young adults who are in the transition from foster care into society could have a stable place to live and count on. Implementing this for 2 to 3 years after being emancipated could help them get steady jobs and save up for a place of their own. They could also use this to help them find a community with other people who have similar backgrounds as they do. The state could regulate these by laying down requirements to live in one of these places. For example, you must have a full-time job or something equivalent to live in these apartments. Having a community and a positive relationship is necessary for successful emancipation. Community and relationships prepare children for the transition into adulthood. These apartments would help establish a support system where they feel independent and positively supported. Along with housing and community, these apartments would teach independence and useful skills for adulthood. Overall, the foster care system has the right intentions, but there are many issues within the system that jeopardize the safety of foster children. The lack of education and in-depth plans for post-emancipation led to young adults struggling with the transition out of the foster care system and into society. Without a steady and supportive community, young adults just leaving the system could easily get mixed up with the wrong crowd, which leads to many problems, including criminal behavior. To improve the system and help foster care children transition into adulthood more successfully, a reliable plan for post-emancipation needs to be established that provides a community and relationships that encourage independence. It is important to have systems in place that provide aid to those within our community that are most vulnerable. Thank you. And these are my slides, or my sources.
Excellent presentation, Madison. And we'll close out the session, of course, before we get to Q&A with John Lefferts.
All righty.
Do you have a, oh, there we go, got it.
Yeah, let's see. Hi, everyone. I'm John Lefferts. I'm a philosophy undergrad. And one of the things that interests me is ideas and to what extent can an idea said to be real, or like what effect do ideas have on the real world? Like ideas aren't like physical things you can touch, but we have, like phrases about them like, ideas are bulletproof, allegedly. So sort of on this topic, I want to explore that. So my presentation here is on neoliberalism. So this is a big word. Some of you might be familiar with it. Others might be totally new. It's actually a pretty simple idea, and hopefully you'll find it intuitive. So there's Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. They're considered to be the political leaders that inaugurated the neoliberal period. So what is it? It's a pro-market, anti-government ideology. It's hegemonic. It's the default ideology of our time. Most politicians, both center-left and center-right, agree on the efficiency of markets, and that as many areas as possible should be given over to market processes. So we're about to have a change in administration, but there's going to be a lot of core assumptions that are going to be similar, and the specific constellations of groups might change from like people who are associated with private school charter interests to maybe people who are associated with the interests of weapons contractors. Neoliberalism is a view that affects social sciences, our ways of knowing, our epistemology. So when we think often in a hegemonic frame. Suppose you could read like Antonio Gramsci and Gramsci scholarship to know more about the idea of hegemony. It generally favors short-term individual benefit over long-term social benefits. One thing I would like to show is when people have certain ideas, they will apply those, and that includes like at the level of power. And so oftentimes we do in the West have a tendency to try to maintain a free market and to support it. That generally works, but not in all cases. Not all functions of the state can be parceled off. So I found one study here in the New Political Economy, which was about the UK military and the privatization of it. Eventually, the experiment in privatization failed and had to be rolled back by conservative governments. So the people who were kind of Thatcher's successors, the same types of people with the same ideological priors. Militaries have evolved over, especially like European militaries, have evolved over hundreds of years, over centuries, to insource their like weapons manufacturing. Because if you leave things up to the market, there's a possibility, for example, that your weapons manufacturer could fail. And that can't happen if you have an institution that needs to maintain a combat readiness. Weaponry is often very sophisticated and expensive. It's constantly evolving from cannons that might have taken down the helped facilitate the fall of Byzantium all the way up to today's hypersonic missiles. The study found that companies would cut corners, compromising safety at times to save on costs. There was an example of a high-profile crash of a military plane, but there was also the troubling example of using private military contractors in the Middle East, the United States, which led to civilian casualties, which is not particularly desirable. And companies had a tendency to lowball the price of their contracts in order to get the contracts, and then afterwards, these projects would go over budget. Generally, it was found that like there were certain functions that the military could outsource pretty effectively, but these tend to be pretty basic stuff, catering, janitorial stuff. But the more sophisticated a project and the more complex, the advantages of scale and other things made it more efficient to just have all that stuff in-house. And then also, there was a phenomenon where when these policies did not pan out, the politicians had a tendency to double down on them. And so as a result, their ideas were sort of impeding like the basically good governance or what would be their goals of maintaining combat readiness. And also the military has a tendency to be like a separate economic ecosystem. They don't produce goods. For example, especially if you're not fighting, you might even say what you're producing is like the good of deterrence or combat readiness, which is it's not really a material thing. Definitely not a commodity as we would normally understand it. So then I also was able to find from 2019, I believe, in the Journal of Social Issues, a study of neoliberalism and psychology. Psychology and a level of especially like therapy has internalized the core ideas of neoliberalism. So one of these tenets is radical abstraction. Neoliberal psychology sees the individual out of their context, out of a cultural, ecological, or historical context. Neoliberal psychology lends the legitimacy of social science to hierarchy and inequality, and has a tendency to blame wider structural problems such as racism on individuals. They use some other examples where this might apply. For example, when you have problems of like addiction or overconsumption, like obesity, oftentimes, you know, that could take place in the context of a food desert or a place where unhealthy foods are aggressively marketed, they're advertised, they tend to be everywhere or just at the front of the store, very easy to get. They may be subsidized in terms of things like corn syrup subsidies, which every South Dakotan should be somewhat familiar with. And then finally, this appeared in Time magazine, and I think it did pretty well in a special issue about the early pandemic, which is when we have politicians who don't really feel that their job is to govern or to lead, that can become an extreme position when it means that lives are on the line. So early on, you know, in the pandemic, we had difficulties with state and federal in terms of whether or not everyone would get help from this federal government, or whether it would be dished out in like a patronage style. And then we have other problems in terms of being able to give like a stimulus to like financial interests, but having difficulty mobilizing the population to deal with the pandemic. You know, having difficulty encouraging people to stay inside, keep their masks, etc. So this reads, any problem that has a scientific, medical, or technological component, the challenge is not simply to mobilize resources when they are needed, but to have them ready in advance. It takes a year or more to build a laboratory. It takes a decade to train a cadre of scientists and engineers. We can no more muster on demand needed expertise and infrastructure to fight a pandemic than we could suddenly raise a professional military, replete with battleships and aircraft carriers within weeks of an attack. Government is needed to address a wide range of problems that markets can't or won't solve on their own. And with the cutting of the pandemic response team by the White House, we see that part of good governance also is, you know, preparing for things in advance, long-term planning, things that we're really not really able to outsource to smaller firms that's really not their job. Oftentimes their prerogatives are short-term profit. And in the lion's share of cases, that's perfectly fine. So there were some recommendations by this paper from the University of Kansas about how we can get past our neoliberal perspective. One would be epistemic disobedience. So like epistemology is like our ways of knowing, or like the late Mark Fisher said, we live in societies where it's simply true that we have a business ontology. It's simply true that everything is better as a business. And so, you know, ideally to better prepare our societies for, you know, once in a century disasters like this, we would have to change our ways of knowing. We can learn to adapt theory from non-weird countries. So, you know, obviously we live in a particular context that's sort of unusual, even globally or historically, Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. And so in order to escape our ideology, we might want to borrow from other perspectives. And finally, they recommend academics should work with marginalized communities towards social justice and sort of get out of their ivory tower to escape institutional perspectives. And that's my presentation. Thank you.
Very nice job, both John and everyone. Excellent presentations all around. We seem to have lost one of our presenters, unfortunately. but the good news is we still have 3 here. And as the MC here, I hope folks don't mind if I grab the opportunity to ask the first question, or I guess questions, because I have a couple for Madison regarding your presentation. First of all, excellent presentation. Love the graphics. Love all of the information that you provided there regarding the foster care system. Very, very interesting. I found the racial breakdown of children in foster care particularly interesting regarding the distributions. I was curious whether you noticed there being a racial group that was overrepresented within kind of the demographics that you have there. And if so, why might they be so represented? I have a follow-up that's unrelated, but I want to give you a chance to answer the first one.
Which one did you think was misrepresented?
Well, not misrepresented, overrepresented.
Overrepresented?
Yeah. So in terms of looking at the representation of the different racial groups in U.S. society, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is. I think that there's a group there in your graphic that suggests that African Americans, for example, might be overrepresented.
Yep, it says 24% of 24% of the children in foster care are African American, mm-hmm. compared to there's 22% Latino and then 42% white.
Right.
I didn't really get into that because I didn't think it correlated enough with the emancipation and everything, so I didn't really look into that much.
Okay, no, that's
sorry.
No, don't be sorry. Don't be sorry at all. I was just curious. Specializing in family, I find it your topic is particularly interesting to me, and I was just curious on your thoughts on it. But if you hadn't gotten there, that's okay. I also noticed in the graphic that regarding emancipation, 1 in 4 experience PTSD, and I was curious if you thought that this was due to participation within the foster care system, or if this is PTSD pre-foster care, due to events pre-foster care.
I actually thought about that, and I was thinking that a lot of the reason people go into foster care is because of pre-foster care abuse and neglect in their families, and then going into foster care. I know everybody's seen heard the horror stories of getting put into a dangerous home with foster parents who are just in it for the money, the little money they get, and they're neglected there. So I think that PTSD can come from either of those, and I don't think that one comes from one more than the other.
Okay. And just for a point of reference, you understood my first question. Not that I'm looking for you to expound on it, but the African American Black population in the United States is about 13-14% of the country, and so 24% suggests overrepresentation. Kind of similar to something that I alluded to in our class when I I can't remember. Are you in? This is bad. Are you in the in-person or the online section?
Online.
Okay, then you would have. Then you wouldn't. Actually, I think it actually is in the slides. But looking at misreferral for special education.
Okay.
And seeing who's overrepresented there, also likely for similar reasons. So if you're interested in the topic, I recommend that. It's a very interesting study.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, y'all.
Thank you.
I have a question. Am I allowed to ask? I'm going to assume. Okay, cool. Louisa, great presentation, by the way. I have a question about the data set because I'm really unfamiliar with it. When religiosity is being defined, does it include people who may provide more amorphous kinds of information, like I'm spiritual but not religious, and how are people of that liminal space dealt with in these kinds of studies, or is this something that is difficult to measure?
Thanks for that question, Sage. thank God I don't have to get, as it were, that I don't have to, that I don't have to get into the spiritual versus religious question, because that's like an insane like debate that seems sometimes unnecessary within sociology. But I just have these basic survey questions that fortunately have been asked over time around the world. And so it doesn't get into spiritual versus religious. It just gets at, you know, how important is God in your life on a, like, I can't remember, like a 1 to 8 scale or something like that. And how often do you participate in religious type stuff? Again, on something like a 1 to 8 scale. And then I standardize each of these questions, which you're familiar with because you know statistics. I standardize each question, add them together, standardize it again, and thus I have my scale. And so hopefully, you know, it's definitely not perfect, and you could quibble with it in different ways, but that's what I do. Do you feel like I'm answering your question, Sage?
Yes, I do.
Good.
Well, I asked because I'm from my brief interactions with other sociologists who have had similar questions. Like, that's always been sort of an interesting area of discussion, is like, where do people of this persuasion fall, and how do you deal with this? Because you're exactly right. You could debate about this all day long. So I was kind of interested in the data set that you have, and how does it deal with that? If not, or how, because I know so little about it. But my other question that I was really interested in your slide that had the regional data with the fits. And what I'm curious about, because something that kind of popped into my mind was this demographic transition theory and epidemiological transition theory, and how different parts of the world that are undergoing rapid urbanization and globalization are adjusting to different problems differently than, say, how countries that are categorized as the West are. And I want to know, from your perspective, are there other kinds of demographic factors that might be coming into play here? Like, how do things like globalization, stress, and urbanization, does that impact religiosity or not? And what you think from that based on your results?
I mean, my results are, you know, pretty, you know, so it's an overall test just of secularization theory, but my results seem to indicate that, you know, the effect of something like urbanization isn't consistent around the world. So urban residents, and I guess specifically in the kind of countries you're talking about, like the developing countries and so on, or non-Western countries. So in most, I guess, Asian, African countries, or at least in those regions on average, there isn't a correlation between whether you live in an urban or rural area and how religious you are. So in a way, I'd have to dig in even deeper into this data. I mean, sort of hopefully this is going to inspire future research, really getting at, like, gee, what is driving religiosity? Because what I'm finding is the secularization theory isn't working. And, I think there's a lot of really culturally specific stories, or societal specific stories about what's going on. I have some theories about what those are, but I guess to make one connection that may or may not be necessary, the idea of the first demographic transition is this idea that, like, modernization in a way is going to happen in the same way around the world, and it's of course been criticized on that basis, that that as things become modern, everything changes in the same way, and specifically what happened in Western countries is going to completely. It has sometimes been suggested or argued that what has happened in Western countries historically is going to totally just replicate itself around the world. And, this is known as modernization theory. And, or at least sometimes it's unfair to modernization theory, but modernization theory has been criticized for that. And secularization theory, you could argue, is kind of a version of modernization theory. And because it's just saying, so yes, religiosity has declined in Western countries. At the same time, those countries have gotten, more modern. And so therefore, the same thing is going to happen around the world. And it's definitely true that Western countries have gotten less religious, or most of them anyway, when it just comes to the way I measure it. And I think on other indices, they've become for sure less religious too, like how much religion is in public discourse and things like that. And that's actually been a really dramatic shift. But yeah, I'm really excited to see. I'm going to do some more research on this and try and dig into. Wow, I'm really rambling, but what are you going to do?
No,
in
you're
Western
fine.
countries, in Western countries, it's been a generational thing. Each, like, depending on what year you're born, you become less and less religious. You know, I don't want to exaggerate that too much, but that's been the tendency. Now, you know, in some Western countries, people have actually gotten more religious over time. So I don't want to exaggerate how comprehensive that is, but that has been this big tendency. So I'm really excited to look at those generational changes around the world and be like, well, in some other countries, was it like each generation gets more and more religious? Or was it some other thing where everyone got more religious at the same time, young people and old people and everything? So if we can understand these generational dynamics, we can predict the future, really. Because if people stay however religious they were at age 20, which to some extent they're inclined to do, then we can know what's going to happen just by demographically understanding population turnover in the future.
That is really cool. I don't want to capitalize your time, but thank you. That was really neat, and I'm really excited to see what comes next. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Excellent questions, and just I also want to underline that since Sage wasn't super familiar with it, for those of us who are interested in working with data, WVS is probably one of the sexier data sets out there. It's got so much information there. It's I would say at least on par with the GSS. If I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar with the GSS or not, General Social Survey. It's just a fountain of information from a host of different countries. You can tackle at least as best as I've explored it, questions from a host of different social science fields. So this isn't a data set just for sociologists, I think anthropologists, philosophers, more or less you name kind of a social science field, you can get something out of it. It's just one of the most versatile data sets that I've seen. It's an excellent source of information. Now, one thing I was curious about, Louisa, was regarding the, and you might have controlled for this, and I was, and you know, it just can't show it, kind of given the limitations of Zoom and graphics and how that works. But I was curious if you controlled for or looked into religious traditions in respect to this particular question.
So yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I decided I didn't want to encourage everyone to jump off a ledge, and so I didn't go into that in detail, into my control variables and whatnot. Yeah, so yeah, I actually did control for percent Protestant, percent Catholic, percent Muslim, and I controlled for world region as well, and I controlled for some other stuff too, but I controlled for those two things, and so, you know, which could be important because you know, the associations between my independent variable, for example, education, and my dependent variable, religiosity, that association could be explained by just the fact that, like, maybe it's cultural differences, they're correlated with education level that's causing variation in religiosity. And so therefore I control for those things to try and eliminate that possibility. So yeah, I did control for that stuff, certainly to some degree.
Louisa, you said in like the Central Saharan that like Christianity and Islam were associated with wealth or like modernity, and so that's why wealthy people adopted it. So do you think it's possible that like, so declines in religiosity in the West, do you think that could be like a self-fulfilling prophecy of thinkers like Marx, Freud, etc.? And also, do you think it's possible to like religiosity, you could like steer it culturally? Like you could say like, this is desirable, this is not desirable, and you could change it based off that?
That's a really great question. There's a field, or a super tiny subfield in sociology known as developmental idealism. And idealism refers to like the idea that ideas matter, something like that. And so developmental idealism is looking at how in Western countries, like beginning in like the 16 and 1700s, there began to be an idea that emerged, a cultural idea about what modernity is, and that and also the idea that Western countries are modern and that modernity is good, and that include all sorts of random things like having fewer children and living in nuclear families instead of extended families, and just like went on and on and on. And they've done a lot of international surveys now, and it's out of the University of Michigan's Population Studies Center primarily. And they've done a bunch of like international surveys that they themselves have created. And they found that all around the world, people can rank countries like 50, you give them 50 countries, they can rank them pretty accurately in terms of developmental level. And they'll tell you, oh yes, so having a small family is correlated with economic development, or it causes economic development. And they can tell you all these things. They're like replicating these arguments that were made like in the 1700s by Western thinkers about like, oh, you get this constellation of things that are modern and good. And so to get at your question, you're saying like maybe like these ideas about secularization generated by Marx and Max Weber and others, could they be a self-fulfilling prophecy? Yeah, they could. Like, I mean, these development idealism people are saying, well, the fact that there's these ideas about development and what's ideal and what's modern around the world, that seems to be shaping behavior in places like Nepal, where they've done a lot of research, for example. Like, ideas about what is modern are shaping the family patterns of people in Nepal. And so the idea that religion is traditional as opposed to modern, is like historical, some artifact or something, could, I think, easily affect how religious people are. So I love your question.
Any other thoughts here? Cheryl, Karen?
I don't have a question, but I actually wanted to thank John for his presentation, because I was so startled to see the word liberal above the heads of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, since I grew up in the Reagan and Thatcher era. And to my mind, it's just always been conservative. And so I was just sort of like, oh, I've had my mind blown a little bit this afternoon, and kind of wrapping my mind around the idea of Reagan and Thatcher in any connotation associated with being liberal or with liberalism.
Oh, 100%. So like what that actually is it's this sort of callback to like especially like British notions of what it meant to be liberal in like the Victorian period. So like democratic, but also like very like market oriented. And so like when we talk about like liberals in the US context, it's kind of its own thing, because like now you might be getting more young people who will say that they are like socialist or something like that, but like liberalism just sort of means like in America and now in a new period, it means like a variety of things. Like it could mean social justice, or like racial equality, or like marriage equality, which are things that like Victorian era liberals would not have recognized in themselves. And so like there's a lot of the discourse about like the American politics is literally just that. It's just discourse. And so like people will today are not always accurate in the way that they talk about things, because not everybody has like a political science degree or anything. So I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you.
John, which class did you prepare this for a class, this report?
Yeah, English 101.
English 101. Cool.
Yeah. I'm non-trad, so I just got on the scene.
Okay. Yeah, with that liberalism thing, there's classical liberalism, which is like Adam Smith and other Enlightenment thinkers, which is exactly what you're saying, John. And then I guess neoliberalism, which is usually negative, like it's almost a pejorative, and it's saying, oh, they're bringing back liberalism and bring back like sort of a hardcore Adam Smith liberalism and Milton Friedman and Hayek and all these people.
Yeah, I did talk about them a little like in the wider essay, but I just didn't want to stuff that in there, you know?
Well, cool. Yeah, that's interesting stuff.
Hey, Louisa, I was wondering, because of, I think, Sage's question, I'm really curious what developed countries are becoming more religious. Do you have any examples? I'm just kind of curious. Maybe you don't have off the top of your head, but I was just curious which countries those would be.
Yeah, I actually came up with a list of them.
Or just a couple of examples.
So, hey, Cheryl, yeah, thanks for that question. I'm annoyed I don't have the list in front of me, but I actually came up, like that question was given to me or asked of me by my funder from the University of Notre Dame. And I actually came up with a list of answers for him. Do I have it? I'm checking real quick. One of them was Portugal.
Really?
For some reason, Portugal stuck in my head, but it was like quite a number of them.
Yeah.
Just a second. Okay. No, it's not quite what I wanted. In a second, I will stop looking for that, Cheryl. But yeah, at the end of my report, I have like data on every single country. And yeah, I'm sorry, I can't. Apparently, I can't share that with you any better.
I was just curious because that's really interesting. And I just was curious if there were some examples. So interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to dig even deeper into this. Like,
yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Cheryl.
I just wondered if it was also, as you said, Portugal. I just wondered also if it was one faith tradition that tends to be ascending in some developed countries compared to other faith traditions, you know. Like I think of Portugal, I don't know, I think of it as more Catholic, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But so
yeah, I feel sure it's mostly Catholic, and it must be something having to do with their particular history. And I should know what it is, but I don't. It's, you know, saying all this worldwide data, it's just like trying to bone up quickly on the particulars of like every country in the world. But
I just thought if it had occurred, you noticed some, that would be interesting, but that's okay. Never mind.
There's been, no, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, I agree. That's particularly interesting in the Western countries, or in the developed countries. There's been some uptick in South Korea. You know, there's been a lot of like Christian missionaries there and stuff like that. There's the Middle East and North Africa has increased somewhat, and I speculate that you know, that politically speaking, the Islamic religion, no, this is based on the arguments of others, has become like more politically salient. Religion has in the Muslim world, what with the advent of like Islamism, and so that may have sort of activated people's religiosity there. And the former Soviet and Eastern Bloc has seen a lot of increase, but of course, a huge part of that is the fall of the USSR, which was actively suppressing, you know, communism and so on, actively suppressing religion.
Right. Yeah. Interesting. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I'll just kind of speculate about real quickly, if you don't mind, is so I found that religiosity was stable, but you know, one thing I guess at the worldwide level, religiosity was stable. But a big part of the reason it was stable was that increase in the former Soviet and Eastern Bloc. Is that a one-time historical event or not? It well could be a one-time historical event, in which case, if I examined 2014 to, I don't know, 2040, there might be a worldwide decrease. That's a good question.
Now, regarding, and of course, you know, this is with the unfortunate implicit assumption that you clearly have the whole list to memory. Did you happen to notice? I guess kind of picking up where Cheryl left off with Catholicism, if several of these countries happen to be majority Catholic, could it be perhaps the kind of the the word is escaping me, but kind of the specific area within Catholicism that prizes, for example, liberation theology. Would that be a factor here, given kind of when you look at the world, you know, our kind of steady move to in many of the developed nations to kind of accept, at least or entertain notions of social justice.
Interesting. And so were you asking whether or not liberation theology might have increased religiosity then?
Yes.
Just to clarify. Okay. Yeah. I mean, well, so.
Or to muddy it further, religious adherence. It's not the same.
Well, you know, there's been a slight decline in religiosity in Latin American countries, you know, most of which are Catholic. And, you know, my understanding is countries like Spain and Italy are less religious than they once were. Now I can bring up that data actually. So that suggests that liberation theology, I mean, I'm a little skeptical about how much liberation theology is reviving religiosity, in part because, and I could be wrong about this, I'm not an area expert, but in Latin America, what you hear is that like Pentecostalism has come in and been a real source of religious growth, taking over from Catholicism. And so I know there's religious growth there. That's interesting. I mean, it certainly could be. It's liberation. I'm sure liberation theology is playing some role that I don't understand. Of course it is. But okay, random.
I don't even.
You don't even know?
Yeah, I don't know either. It was I'm far less of an expert on the field than you are.
Well, Louisa,
Spain has become a lot less religious. Okay, yeah, Karen.
Did you say that a lot of the increase or the sort of stability over time of religiosity is due to increases in the former Soviet bloc and sort of counterbalancing decreases elsewhere? So how much of that over the time frame that you were looking at, I mean, obviously, as you said, the fall of the Soviet Union, but also the charisma of Pope John Paul II, which especially in that part of the world would probably possibly increase religiosity in newly liberated societies.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, some of those Central and East European countries are Catholic, whereas some of them are Eastern Orthodox. So that's certainly possible, Karen. That's something an area expert is going to be able to speak to for sure, better than I can. But that's a plausible factor there. Yeah.
And I think potentially
for your question
on that, with the note in kind of the increase in Southeast Asia, right? You might
decrease.
Oh, I thought I saw it was an increase in Southeast Asia.
It was a shocking decrease.
Maybe I guess I misremembered the graphs then.
And yeah, sorry, but I'm trying to bring it up. Yeah, Southeast Asia. I think Philippines didn't have a big decrease. I mentioned that since your wife is from the Philippines.
Yeah, no, I can speak from experience. No. No. Part of that may be just that they like to party too much and all the festivals are religiously tied.
Yeah, I think Thailand had a big decrease. think that was the country that did. Anyway, yeah.
Because when you mentioned South Korea having kind of an uptick in Christianity, it also occurred to me that China has also started to see a little bit of an uptick in Christianity as well, with at least temporarily with the Communist Party being a little bit laxer there in terms of religious restrictions. You saw Christianity start to creep in a little bit into China. Of course, they're kind of poo-pooing that now within the, I think actually just this year. We started to see a little bit of encroachment there with demands that revisions of the New Testament and the Quran be made immediately in terms of the versions that were being distributed, to provide versions that were more in line with kind of party ideology.
I had not heard that, and that is wild. And of course, in China right now, there's that horrific repression of the Uyghur population that's Muslim right now. Hey, would you mind if I super quickly share screen?
Share away.
Okay, share away. Yeah, so if you look at the world chart and how religious people are, there's one like outlier country, and that's actually China. And so in 1990, it was like as unreligious as possible. And then it increased from 1990 to, I can't remember what that year was, maybe 2007. And it was a big increase in religiosity. And that happened because of at least in part because the harsh government restrictions on religiosity decreased. And then we get a decrease after that, but it's still much higher than it was. So those just severe government repression where no one practiced religion or was allowed to or whatever say they did. So
Louisa, I was glad to see those graphs again, because the question I had was related to statistics. And I don't necessarily want to get into it in great detail, but can you give me like a one sentence version of like, how do you determine whether a trend is significant or not when you're looking at so much variability amongst nations of the world?
So when it comes to that, I had a real simple little, well, not entirely simple, but the front part of the equation was simple, where I was looking at what's the effect of year. So I looked region by region as well as the world. What's the effect of year on level of religiosity? And I tried to see if the effect of year was statistically significant. And if it's not statistically significant, that means that based on the rules of probability, we cannot be confident that the effect of year is different from 0. And if it was statistically significant, it would mean that based on the rules of probability, we can be, we can be 95% or more confident that that there was change over time. There was something about, and of course, what that means is a little bit complicated when we're trying to extrapolate to the population of all Southeast Asian countries, which isn't that many or whatever. But I guess I need to think about this more, but it's sort of like, you can imagine need to imagine that there's a lot of possible Southeast Asian countries that could exist, and we're trying to, something like that. So that is a little bit tricky, but that's what that means, more or less.
Thank you.
No problem. Thank you for your question.
And a cool thing about longitudinal methods, it's there. I think one of the only 2 methods we have that get us close to being able to make causal statements, because we are verboten from making causal statements in social sciences. And thanks for sharing the screen, because I now see that I added south when I should have just said east, because I saw that there's an uptick in East Asia, not Southeast Asia.
Yeah. No problemo.
So regarding the uptick in East Asia, is there a particular group that you saw making inroads there?
If you'd like, I can share screen again and show you the appendix. of
Do
my
all
paper.
the sharing, but not everybody.
Okay.
It's one at a time.
Okay, yeah, that's right. Okay, I'm trying to escape and show you the appendix of this your paper. Let's go to East Asia. So, okay, look away while I scroll. Okay, now we're looking at the data on East Asia. Let's see. So in 2001, which is unfortunately our first date for South Korea. Okay, honestly, the increase in South Korea has been pretty small. There's been a decrease in religiosity in Taiwan since 1994. Of course, Taiwan, Taiwan was kind of formed in contrast to communist China, and so religion was always allowed there. Japan stayed pretty steady. Hong Kong got less religious, and China got somewhat more religious. So what I've said about East Asia is that you have a mixed change pattern. So the South Korean story is, okay, yeah, there's been an increase, but it's been moderate, moderate at best. I guess when you go into some of these, if we're to go into some other regions, we could find countries that have become markedly more religious. Although, yeah, China is the religion success story for East Asia. So that's helping me remember what the heck, what the heck my data say. So, yeah.
Now, do you think that the decrease in Taiwan is due to kind of Taiwan going, or not Taiwan, Hong Kong rather, Hong Kong going from independent to no longer independent? Because there's a sharp decrease. It's pretty much a nosedive.
That's a great question. Let me look at that Hong Kong data. So the Hong Kong data is for 2005 and for 2014. And yeah, you're right, there is a sharp decrease. And I don't know enough about the restrictions on political and religious freedom in 2014 versus 2005. So I don't know if you know, but if we had a Hong Kong expert, they could tell us whether religious freedom between 2005 and 2014 was significantly restricted. I would love to know that answer. It would be interesting. Not necessarily, because it looks like Taiwan got less religious too. And there seems like there's some similarity between Hong Kong and Taiwan in certain ways, perhaps. Maybe, maybe not. But Hong Kong seems like a weird place because it's so wealthy and so urban. I don't really have a grasp on how religion would work in a society like that.
Well, Yesh asked the same question that I was thinking, like, did it stem from effects of Britain turning Hong Kong back over to China in, what was it, 1999 or something like that?
Yeah.
So.
Well, and of course it's right, because certainly these poor Hong Kong people, their freedoms have been more and more restricted since 1999, despite promises to the contrary. And so it's definitely a plausible explanation. And also, with surveys, people could, if they felt intimidated, they could downplay how religious they are.
So in future, can you do a study to see how pandemic affects religiosity around the world?
I could. I think I would have to use other data. Pew is surveying countries a little more often. Their data doesn't go back so far, so I'm not using it. But there's actually been contestation and scholarly disagreement over whether or not societal shocks, cause upsurges in religiosity or not. I'm aware of a recent study about how societal shocks in Britain, this is by some secularization theory guys, societal shocks in Britain didn't cause the country to get more religious. But there's definitely also theories out there that say that societal shock should cause increased religiosity. I think that's a really interesting question, Karen.
Although if one of your metrics was attendance at church services or religious services, then that would also be impacted by pandemics.
Yeah, I couldn't use that one. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I suppose like we social scientists, because we struggle to do regular old experiments, you know, COVID would be a natural experiment if you can, you know, compare
That's
February 2020 with what, July 2020 or what have you.
And we didn't even need to take it through IRB. It just happened.
That's the best kind of
lucky
experiment.
us.
All right, well, any other questions for our esteemed presenters? All right, then I will pause our recording now. Oh, Karen, did you have something?
No, I was just going to thank everybody. It's been delightful.
Fantastic.